Hello, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. My name is James Milner. I'm a professor of political science at Carleton University, and I have the real privilege of being the project director for LERRN, the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network. LERRN is a partnership between researchers, civil society partners, and refugee leaders in Canada and other parts of the world, but especially focused on the priorities identified by our working groups in East Africa and in the Middle East. Through research, training, capacity sharing, policy engagement, and public dialogue, we're working to better understand and enhance the role of civil society in the functioning of the global refugee regime, especially in pursuit of protection and solutions both with and for refugees. A very important part of this work is to understand and amplify the knowledge and the perspective that comes from those most affected by displacement, not only refugees themselves, but those living and working in refugee hosting countries, primarily in the global south. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which I live and work is the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg people. I say that not just out of respect and protocol, but out of a deep recognition that these questions of displacement and dispossession are not only issues that affect countries like Lebanon and Jordan, as we'll discuss today, but are very much woven into the history of the land on which I live and work. And I'm grateful to be a guest on this land. So with that, let me say how delighted I am to have some 100 registrants join us for this very, very special webinar to launch this really tremendous and fantastic book, which with my camera on blur, you won't be able to see the cover. So I'll deal with that. But if I can get the link to the book to be plopped into the chat box, please. This book, The Politics of Refugee Policy in the Global South, by Dr. Ola El-Taliawi, who's with us here today with other speakers who we'll introduce in a moment. This is a really wonderful occasion to introduce and celebrate a really special book. But before we get into the book, let me deal with some questions of netiquette and some practicalities. First of all, please note that this webinar is in the view-only format. So what that means is at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the Q&A box. Please use the Q&A box in the audience to pose your questions and any comments that you'd like. I'll curate those comments in the second half of the webinar to support the discussion with the panelists. But please be respectful in the questions that you pose in the Q&A box. Inappropriate behavior or the use of hurtful or harmful language will lead to your removal from the webinar. So please be considerate of everyone participating. Second, if you have any technical issues along the way, please send an email to learn@carleton.ca. We'll be able to then help you out with any of the technical questions you have. And also, please join the conversation on social media by tagging @learning in your posts on social media, and we're keen to continue this conversation along the way. Finally, please note that this webinar is being recorded and that a recording will be posted on the LERRN website in the coming weeks. So please keep an eye on our social media platforms and also at carleton.ca/learn, and you'll be able to see when the video is posted. So we really hope you enjoy this webinar, and we really thank you for joining as we discuss Dr. El-Taliawi's book, The Politics of Refugee Policy in the Global South. Let me say a few words of introduction about why this book is so important. It's important not only for what it argues, but when it makes its argument. This is a really critical time for the global refugee regime. 75% of the world's refugees are in low and middle income countries in what we refer to as the global south. But this is at a time when the very structures of the global refugee regime are in jeopardy. And they're in jeopardy because when the regime was established in the aftermath of World War II, it was established on a premise of stable funding, especially from the United States and its allies. There were competing visions of how the refugee regime would be established, and the vision that was ultimately adopted was the one that was proposed by the United States. A decision to suspend U.S. funding to the refugee regime and its core institution, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, that decision taken earlier this year, means that there's a $2.8 billion hole in funding for global refugee responses. This accelerates pressures of challenges of international cooperation and burden and responsibility sharing that we have seen really accumulating over the last decade, if not more. And so it's an even more critical time to understand what motivates major refugee hosting countries like Lebanon, like Jordan, in how they engage with the large scale presence and the sustained presence of refugees on its territory. But perhaps more significantly, the book draws our attention to a set of tools we have at our disposal that we haven't previously used. What we draw on is an understanding of the value of using the tools of public policy as a subfield in our analysis of refugee hosting states. In the chat box, you see a link to an analysis of the literature on refugee and forced migration studies and an analysis of how underemployed tools of public policy studies are in our understanding of why refugee hosting states in the global south respond the way that they do. So this book comes at a time where we face these incredible challenges within the refugee regime, but it also comes at a time where we need all of the analytical tools we have at our disposal to be able to better understand the realities that we're confronting today. So our hope is that drawing on these tools not only provides important analytical lessons, but also very practical lessons in how to engage with the challenges of protection and solution today. Let me also just note that this book is part of an exciting and innovative series. I say that not only because I'm a co-editor of the series, but because I think it plays a very important role in the literature today. This is the McGill-Queen's University Press series on refugee and forced migration studies. To learn more about the series, please click on the link below. In addition to trying to publish innovative books, the series is really focused on ensuring that the literature in refugee and forced migration studies reflects the diversity of perspectives that exist and the diverse forms of knowledge that we have. And Ola talks about that importance of positionality in the methodology section of the book. But I also want to note for anyone who's joining this webinar from outside of a Global North institution where you're able to access the book through your university library, on the website that was listed there, if you are a community partner or if you're in the Global South and don't have access to the book through an institutional repository, you're able to access the book for free thanks to this partnership with McGill-Queen's University Press. So please take advantage of that. So with that introduction out of the way, let me say that we have three really wonderful speakers with us today to discuss this book, and I'm so looking forward to learning from all of them. So the way that we'll proceed is first we're going to hear from the author of the book, Dr. Ola El-Taliawi. Dr. El-Taliawi is a tenured assistant professor of public administration and policy science at the University of Twente in the Netherlands. She's also an elected college member of the International Public Policy Association. We had the great joy of hosting Ola for her postdoc at Carleton University in the context of LERRN through the pandemic. So while we interacted quite a bit online and while Ola was physically in Ottawa, it was quite a journey that she navigated with grace and wisdom and tenacity. So Ola, thank you for everything that you've contributed and congratulations on this book. After Ola's presentation, we're going to hear from two really wonderful colleagues who are pioneers and real champions in the field. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Gerasimos Tsourapas. He's a professor of international relations at the University of Glasgow. He serves as the chair of the Ethnicity, Nationalism, and Migration Studies section of the International Studies Association for a little bit more time, Gerasimos. And he's also the editor-in-chief of Migration Studies, the journal from from Oxford University Press. Gerasimos has done really amazing work on the field of migration diplomacy and on the forms of power that's both expressed and experienced by states on the borders of Europe in particular. His leadership in scholarship and in the field has been really valuable and opened doors for so many people. So Gerasimos, thank you for all that you do, and thank you for joining us on the webinar today. After hearing Gerasimos' comments, we're going to hear from Jasmin, Lilian, Diab. She's the director of the Institute for Migration Studies at the Lebanese American University, where she also serves as an assistant professor and coordinator of migration studies in the Department of Communication, Mobility, and Identity. She has a truly remarkable publication record. As I was saying before, just to look at her publication in 2025 alone, she's already published on topics ranging from the cyclical nature of displacement between Lebanon and Syria, on the inclusion of migrant and refugee resistance in Lebanon's anti-racist feminist struggle. She's written on how inclusive disaster management for refugees and hosts has reassembled communities in a disintegrated city after the Beirut blast. She's looked at framing compassion and condemnation in refugee portrayals through a political media cycle of reinforcement. The work that she does is remarkable, not only in the scholarship, but on public commentary. And so, Jasmin and Gerasimos, it's fantastic to have you both with us. But let's get started, Ola, with you. Tell us about this magnificent book to get us started. Ola, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, James, for this very, very generous introduction. And because your screen maybe is a bit blurred, this is the book. I'd like to first start by thanking everyone who's in attendance with us today virtually from, like you said, around the world. And also to the panelists. I feel truly humbled to be in the presence of such great scholars. This is a really good chance for me to present this book to a broad audience and to hear your insights and to have further discussion about what has basically taken now almost a decade of my life. So the title of the book is, as James mentioned, The Politics of Refugee Policy in the Global South. And I'm going to share my screen. So why this topic? Why do we need a book on the politics of refugee policymaking in the Global South? As James has mentioned, the number of forcibly displaced people around the world has increased exponentially over the past years to 120 million. Refugees make up almost 43.4 million of this global forcibly displaced population. Refugees also represent a complex policy problem to host governments, especially in countries of the Global South, where there's limited capacity to provide assistance, and in the case of mass refugee flows, where there is a necessity to provide humanitarian assistance right away. And contrary to alarmist media images in the news, the majority of the world's refugees are in fact not based in the global north, but they originate and they settle in the global south, where an estimated 75% of the world's refugees are hosted in global south countries, including low-income countries. And these are estimates according to UNHCR's latest report. These developed countries alone host 21% of this global refugee population. Also, besides these exponential numbers, refugees are also becoming increasingly urban. They're no longer contained in safe havens around borders, but they are settling in urban and peri-urban areas. And so they are seen as a threat to countries' economic, demographic, environmental, and political cohesion. And this, of course, is demonstrated by the rise in the anti-refugee rhetoric in many parts of the world. And of course, while an international refugee framework exists, as James has mentioned, it has been recently very much inadequate in coping with the realities of southern displacement because it doesn't provide enough rules for all countries to be able to share in the responsibility of hosting refugees. So the imbalanced geographic distribution, the exponential increase in the number of refugees worldwide, specifically in the global south, and their increasing urbanization and the lack of clear parameters for burden sharing all make the granting of asylum and service provision to refugees a highly complex policy issue. And so it's very important to understand refugee policymaking processes in the global south being distinct from those that happen in the global north. And this is for a variety of reasons. One of them is that refugee policymaking in the global south often takes place in the context of mass displacement rather than the resettlement of individual asylum seekers, which happens predominantly in the case of industrialized developed countries. Also, policymaking processes in developed versus developing economies differ owing to their differing contexts. Global South countries largely face pre-existing economic realities that generate different outcomes from countries in the global North. They are also sites of unique dynamics, including relationship with international organizations and donor countries that lead to bargaining processes and variations in refugee protection. Developing countries also may not follow statutory international protection norms that are largely set in the North, which may often lead to inconsistent protection space that expands and shrinks depending on circumstances. Global North countries also have higher capacity to provide assistance, and they tend to be located further from the epicenter of mass refugee flows. And so they have a different set of policy options that face policymakers. And this is evident by the diversity of the responses that are adopted by host governments, sometimes even in the same region. And so this compels us to try to better understand how and why governments in the South respond to mass refugee situations, especially given the fact that refugee protection norms are not universal everywhere. However, forced migration studies also is yet to systematically engage with these kinds of policy variations that exist. And we often fail to consider the unique complexities of refugee policymaking in major refugee hosting states in the global South. And so there is a gap that exists in the literature, primarily due to the disproportion in the knowledge production by scholars who are based in the global North, and what has been sort of coined as the Western-centric nature of comparative refugee studies that exist today. And the research questions that have guided this book have really been formulated to contribute to this understanding of refugee policymaking in the global South through the comparative analysis of policy responses of two countries of first asylum or first entry to the Syrian refugee movement, namely Lebanon and Jordan. And so the first question that I've posed in this book is, how do we analyze and understand how governments in the global South respond to refugee movements? And how have the governments of Jordan and Lebanon precisely responded to Syrian displacement over time? And what has influenced their policy decisions? And what explains the variations in policy outputs between them, despite similarities in their context and the displacement features? In terms of scholarly novelty, the literature on conflict-induced mass displacement can be divided broadly into non-policy centric, that takes a bottom-up perspective by looking at refugee livelihoods and coping strategies. And this is largely the literature that exists out there. There's also another strand of literature that is policy-centric and takes a top-down approach or perspective, looking at state perspectives and government policies but this literature tends to focus on countries of resettlement. And so the policy-centric work on countries of first asylum tends to be much less. And so this book makes a contribution to this, advancing the scholarship. So again, while much work has been done on refugee policies in countries of resettlement, less attention has been given to countries of first asylum or first entry, which in fact witness the majority of refugee flows. And so understanding the conditions under which governments choose to respond to mass refugee flows would help us understand how to reduce the negative consequences of forced displacement. And understanding how asylum policies are formulated would bridge the gap between normative expectations of what should happen and what actually happens in practice. And this is very important because lesson learning is pivotal for the reform of the global refugee regime, which is said to be currently in crisis, as James has mentioned. So before I talk about the findings of the book and its methodology, I'd like to problematize some of the key terms and the concepts that I use in the book. The first one, when I use the words crisis and emergency, this is not meant to pathologize refugee movements as it happens often in the media, but to highlight certain governance challenges that are faced by host governments and humanitarian actors in responding to a mass displacement situation. Also, a mass influx for the non-expert audience is a technical definition that is used by UNHCR for guiding refugee protection outside of the Geneva Convention conditions. Again, the Global South as a term is a term that I understand has limitations in oversimplifying uneven developments among countries in the Global South, but it is used in this the context of this book broadly to understand some of the shared historical processes in less developed regions of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Oceania. And this is not to homogenize them completely, but to give us sort of an analytical grouping or categorization to use. When we talk about developed versus developing economy dichotomy, we also recognize that these categories have historical connotations and biases in how they were developed during the Cold War. But in the context of this book, they are used only in reference to state of economic development. So the book primarily uses a complexity approach to analyze refugee policymaking in the Global South. And so to answer the primary research question, I've developed a comparative analytical framework that is based on the policy responses of host governments and their drivers in the refugee studies literature. I also incorporate a complex systems thinking approach and its use in public policy and policy sciences in order to be able to answer this primary research question of how do we analyze and come to understand how governments in the South respond to mass refugee movements. But why use complexity as an analytical approach as opposed to using many of the other approaches at hand? I argue that refugee emergencies constitute a crisis situation. And so this is a unique situation that needs us as scholars and analysts to avoid using any static or reductionist notions of asylum provision through incorporating a dynamic perspective that takes into account the change and the development of events and policies over time. And this is especially important because policy changes during humanitarian emergencies are expected to happen at a much faster pace than, of course, regular times. Also because of refugees' political marginality, which means that often decisions regarding refugees in host countries happen very rapidly and not necessarily with their inclusion at all. And so we need to avoid simplistic notions of there being a single overriding concern that motivates government's policy choices. to developing or having a more complex understanding of how a variety and a constellation of factors and their changes over time influence these policy decisions. And so this is a framework, an analytical framework that uses complex systems thinking as a way to understand or analyze refugee policymaking processes in the global South by looking at them in terms of policy inputs, process, and outputs, and also dividing the drivers of policies into three categories or arenas: the international arena, the host arena, and the displacement arena. These arenas are, of course, in interaction. So everything you see in this framework is supposed to be very dynamic. And also to categorize the policy outputs in terms of policies on entry and stay, livelihood, and durable solution. And as the policies change and are implemented, they feed back into the system. Also, to help analyze the policy responses, I built on Karen Jacobson's 1996 framework that looks at the policies, not just in terms of one policy response, but in terms of a continuum. So it's not a dichotomy. We can find fully open responses or fully restrictive responses. And this depends on the policy choices the governments make. So some of the research propositions that have guided this book include that host governments' policy responses to mass influx situations are influenced by three things. The first is the international regime via international assistance, advocacy, and the setting of protection standards. So these are the propositions that we find in the literature that previous scholars have come up with. Also, domestic considerations, including stance towards the conflict itself, previous refugee hosting experience, social receptiveness towards the refugee population, economic and environmental considerations, and security. And also there are the displacement features themselves, including the nationality, the volume of the movement, ethnicity, length of stay, and movement character. So in terms of research design, I developed this study based on a qualitative comparative case study approach, where I conduct within and across case analysis. And the unit of analysis in this case was the policy response itself. And this book looks at the developments and the policies towards Syrian displacement over an 11-year period, starting 2011, when the Syrian refugee movement started, and until the end of 2022, including the COVID-19 period. But of course, comes the question, why focus on Syrian displacement rather than another refugee movement? And this specific displacement was chosen for empirical demonstration. In terms of scale and intensity, the Syrian refugee population continues to be the largest globally after Ukraine. Its instrumental nature, of course, so this movement provides an opportunity to analyze responses to the same sort of external shock that happens at the same time. It mixes between emergency and protracted features, and also because of its contribution to the literature, where we are seeing a burgeoning literature on Syrian displacement, but mostly dominated by single cases or bottom-up perspectives, again, that look at livelihoods or focus on single variables like foreign policy and its influence on refugee policies. And so what the literature sometimes misses out on is this complex dynamic perspective and the use of a public policy framework to guide its analysis. Again, why Lebanon and Jordan? They are both border-sharing first asylum countries. They're among the top 5 refugee hosting countries worldwide, and so they're very important to study. They are both non-signatory countries to the Geneva Convention, and so they are a subset of countries in the global South that we need to understand more of. They have experienced the same exogenous shock that happened at the same time. They share the same regional context of the Arab Spring, but at the same time, they have some varying arrangements. And so they are comparable from a research perspective. And so this allows us to explore policy variations that happen between them across space and time. And here I, for instance, look at some of the differences or similarities between them, including ethnic composition. So, of course, they're both mostly Arab countries, predominantly Muslim, with more religious diversity, of course, in the case of Lebanon. They have different political regimes, but they share similar socioeconomic indicators, including having a high human development indicator. Neither of them is a party to the Geneva Convention, but they both have memorandums of understanding with UNHCR. And they both have histories of either refugee hosting or refugee outflows. But they also, as I said, have some varying arrangements that are very important to take into consideration. And one of them is their geopolitical positions in the Middle East region, with Jordan being a sort of a stabilizing Western ally versus Lebanon, which is a site of regional proxy contestation. Also, involvement in and stance on the Syrian conflict itself and relations with the Syrian regime. And very importantly, relationship with the international donor community in terms of stability of relations and accountability. And also their experiences with Palestinian refugee hosting. So in terms of data, this book relies on the use of primary data, including 59 semi-structured in-depth interviews that were collected over 2 rounds of fieldwork in 2017 and 2021, and the analysis of over 300 government documents and speeches, NGO reports and gray literature, newspapers in both Arabic and English. I used 2 analytical techniques, including process tracing and chronologies in the analysis of the events and the policy responses and how they evolved over time. So I won't be able to, of course, go into the findings of every case. I can talk about this book forever, so I'm sure you don't want that. But right now, I'm going to just briefly present the key cross-comparative findings between the 2 countries facing the same mass influx situation. So in terms of convergence and divergence in Jordan and Lebanon's policy responses to Syrian displacement between 2011 and 2022, we've seen an overall, in terms of overall degree of response restrictiveness, they've moved from a non-restrictive response between 2011 and 2013 to a sort of a semi-restrictive response. In terms of response focus, they've both moved from a focus on refugee assistance to a focus on raising host resilience over time. In terms of policy response elements, they converged on some elements, primarily policies on entry and exit, where they both continue to stick to their policy on prohibiting local integration. Also, they diverged on their policies on stay, specifically regards registration suspension that happened in 2015 in Lebanon, and livelihood, precisely regarding encampment. So Jordan, of course, we all know, has created refugee camps for Syrian, whereas Lebanon has opposed that. In terms of policy formulation and implementation processes, Jordan has had a relatively more coherent and effective response that is more centralized and has been much more hands-on, whereas Lebanon has had a more fragmented and much less effective response with a lot of variation across municipalities. So as I was working on this book, I witnessed several puzzles. One of them was that despite hosts' varying arrangements, such as their stance towards the conflict, their geopolitical positions, their response evolution and the degree of restrictiveness that they've exhibited towards the refugee movement was more or less similar. But the system analysis, so looking at the policy responses and their contexts, using the framework from a very macro perspective, revealed convergence in host responses happened during the initial crisis stage. So you see here the three arenas were really in harmony. And this led to a non-restrictive response for the most part. But as the crisis became prolonged, these arenas started to diverge or become in tension. And so this led to a semi-restrictive response in order to ensure domestic stability. The second puzzle was that despite the increase in these restrictive features, both responses remained semi-restrictive to the Syrian refugee population. And the data showed that this was aided by the existence of international norms that still bind these two countries, despite they are not signatory to the Geneva Conventions. Also, the provision of international assistance, the existence of local and religious norms of hospitality, and the importance of extending generosity and hospitality to strangers. Also, some features of the displacement itself, including its ethnic compatibility and the high political visibility of this specific refugee movement. The third puzzle was that despite their different policy choices regarding certain elements, the degree of restrictiveness was more or less similar. And this was revealed to be because, as Dowding has mentioned in 2015, open systems that are organic and dynamic, they exhibit something called the equifinality of outcomes, which means that sometimes we can reach the same outcome through different pathways. So Lebanon's fragmented policy subsystem reduced its policy and administrative capacity to respond coherently and effectively to the refugee crisis. And this is one of the findings, whereas Jordan's homogeneous policy subsystem, which refers to the actors and the institutions that govern refugee affairs, raised its ability to formulate and implement a more coherent and effective response. So beyond Lebanon and Jordan, we can infer from these cases about the politics of variation in refugee policy in the global south across space and time. And these two countries have revealed the importance of analyzing responses to complex policy dilemmas, especially in humanitarian crisis situations, from a macro perspective that considers the system components and the role in shaping policy outcomes. They also confirmed that host policy responses to mass refugee flows are not the result of a single overriding factor, but a constellation or a variety of complex and dynamic factors that change over time and that are in interaction. And so they've also revealed the existence of diverse sources of norms, including local norms, as constraining devices on host behavior. Certain drivers, for instance, like humanitarian norms, may play a role in influencing host responses, but as we've seen in these two cases, this can happen up to a certain point, after which other drivers, such as security, can take precedence. And this lends support to the need for a dynamic perspective across time. And so I demonstrate here in the case of Jordan, how the initial responsive drivers looked like and how policy change evolved over time, including the drivers, of course. So the propositions that have guided the research have largely been confirmed. The global refugee regime influences a host's response via assistance, advocacy, and protection standards. But these cases have shown that the extent of the influence is mediated by the degree of assistance provided, also the host capacity to respond to the crisis alone, and its relationship to the international donor community. Also, domestic considerations and displacement features influencing host behavior include, as I've mentioned in the framework, security, resource capacity, social receptiveness, demographic considerations, and stance towards the conflict, and some of the displacement features, including ethnic affinity, movement character, volume, and length of stay. So all of these things, or all of these factors and variables, we've seen them come to play in these cases. Also, hosts tend to alter their policy elements to cater to their needs in light of the constraints. So they use strategies to navigate the complex policy terrain, including Kagan's, what he referred to in 2012 as the shifting of responsibility to UN agencies to reduce resource pressures. Also, sort of accommodating the existing refugee population while preventing new flows, and trying to maintain the visibility or the invisibility of the refugee presence through the policies that they enact. Lebanon and Jordan's policy responses to the Syrian refugee movement were not the result of rational or intentional policy design decisions, but were emergent from the system dynamics. So it's a very organic process that happens. And this has been demonstrated by these cases. One of the contributions of this book is that it provides or develops a topology to try to understand the variation in host government behavior in the global south in terms of constraints on host government behavior and involvement in the conflict. And so high constraints with high involvement, we might see a host government trying to contain the refugee problem or the refugee presence, as in the case of Lebanon. High involvement versus low constraints might lead to a politicization of the refugee presence, including as we've seen in the case of Turkey. High constraints with low involvement was demonstrated by Jordan's attempt to try to sort of capitalize on the refugee presence. It's already there since they'd better make use of the situation. Also, low constraints and low involvement might see a host government trying to just simply accommodate the presence of the refugee movement, as in the case of Iraq. Also, it provides some implications for effective refugee governance in the global south, and without, again, trying to be prescriptive or trying to say that we shouldn't take into consideration the contextual specificity of every case, but to build on the lessons learned from over a decade of hosting the Syrian refugee movement. One of the lessons is for host governments in the global south witnessing a mass influx situation to take this opportunity to improve pre-crisis services, also to invest in national institutions rather than creating parallel systems, improving coordination and participatory planning between stakeholders, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that more during the discussion. Also, very importantly, enhancing policies dialogue between stakeholders, primarily also with refugees, and realizing that security and sovereignty are very important, but shouldn't be the only response drivers, and neither can humanitarianism. And so a third way that realizes the interest of the host as well as the needs of the refugee population needs to be forged. Incentive mechanisms need to be put in place to better harmonize hosts' arenas by capitalizing on resources and reducing host constraints. I won't go into the book scope and limitations, and I will leave this to the attendants when they do read the book. But this book has made a fourfold contribution by providing practical implications and lessons for refugee hosting through its methodological design in using process tracing, the empirical edition of 2 cases of policymaking in the Global South, and the theoretical edition of an analytical framework that's based on complex systems thinking to analyze refugee policymaking in the Global South. And before I end, of course, it's very hard to try to mention all the people, all the organizations, all the ministries that I'm deeply indebted to that have helped during the fieldwork, during the production of this book, which started at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in 2015. I've been given a lot of assistance from great colleagues at the American University in Cairo and in Beirut, at also the Columbia Global Centers in Amman. And I'm very indebted, of course, to Carleton University, where I further developed the book, and to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and the University of Twente, that have funded the book's open access availability to institutions and scholars in the Global South. And of course, to the great LERRN team, which has been there for me in thick and thin. But most importantly, of course, I dedicate this book to Syrian refugees in the Syrian population who have regained their freedom, and to Palestinian refugees and refugees around the world. And also to the principle of refugee protection, which I think is currently under grave attack. And I dedicate this book to this principle, so that we all always remember that refugee protection needs protection. So without further ado, thank you very much for your attention. And
Thank
to
you so
purchase the book, this is the QR code and the link that James has shared.
Thank you so much, Ola. That was a very rich presentation of the book, and it really showed all the different facets in which the book makes contributions to specific contexts, but more generally, methodologically, analytically as well. So we have about half an hour now, and we're going to get some quick reactions and reflections from Gerasimos and Jasmin. Already many of you have put comments in the Q&A box, and I'm keeping track of them all, so that we'll have a chance to then weave those ideas and questions that you've been posing into our discussion to follow. So without further ado, Gerasimos, let me pass the floor to you for your thoughts and comments on what we've heard and on the book itself. Gerasimos, over to you, please.
Sure. Thank you, James, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure and a true honor to be able to offer a few reflections on this excellent book by Ola El-Taliawi, The Politics of Refugee Policy in the Global South. This is a timely, sophisticated intervention. It's one that significantly enriches our understanding of refugee governance, particularly with, as she said in her presentation, this increasingly vital subfield of comparative policy analysis beyond the West, right? I think one of perhaps the most substantial intellectual contribution the book is making is that it offers us this longitudinal comparative account of Jordan and Lebanon's policymaking in response to Syrian displacement. And that alone distinguishes the book. For those of us working on this crisis, much of the existing literature that we keep citing over time does appear to be frozen in specific moments in time during that long decade. A lot of it might be focused on this hopeful phase of the Jordan Compact. A lot of literature also exists in the chaos of Lebanon's so-called policy of non-policy. A lot of it is pre-COVID, so it doesn't take a lot of politics that has emerged after that into account. What El-Taliawi does instead is she gives us this full arc analysis from 2011 to 2022, and in doing so, she traces not just the policies or policy positions, but policy evolution as well, right? From this early openness to gradual restriction, from an era of improvisation almost to recalibration and formalization. And it is rare to come across such a diachronic lens in the literature, and I think this is something that we're urgently in need of. The second point that I could make is that, as you have probably seen by the presentation, the empirical depth is formidable. I had a second read of the book before this seminar. It draws on over 600 sources. It has 2 rounds of fieldwork. It confronts a number of so-called weaknesses: data scarcity, contradictory narratives, institutional weakness, and it confronts this head-on, right? It works through these challenges and it doesn't work around them. And as a result, what we are gifted with is this textured study that maps tensions between formal policymaking and informal practice. And she does this with impressive care. She doesn't, Ola doesn't just kind of gesture at complexity, but she tries to build it into the very structure of her method. And that is wonderful. At the very heart of the move is of the book is this conceptual point that I think bears emphasis, namely that refugee policy making in the global south is not treated as a deviation from northern norms. And it's not really a puzzle to be solved. It is analyzed on its own terms, right? So the book offers this grounded framework that accounts for the interplay of international, of domestic, and displacement arenas. And it shows how they operate together rather than in isolation. And in doing so, I was particularly happy to see scholarship that foregrounds the agency of global South states, while also, of course, remaining clear-eyed about the structural inequalities that have become embedded in the global refugee regime. One of the more subtle parts of the book that I think bears mentioning, because it's quite illuminating, is this use of the policy subsystems framework. So variation in refugee policy isn't really reduced to regime type, as one would expect, or strategic alignment, or anything like that. It is shown to emerge rather organically from these internal configurations of policy actors, right? So we see the density, the coherence, or as Jasmin will probably talk about in Lebanon's case, this fragmentation of state structures and how these lead to variation. So this helps explain both the initial divergence of policy paths, but also their subsequent convergence towards restrictions. My area of expertise is international relations, and one of the things I found particularly impressive is the attention to local actors. Local actors, coordination mechanisms, this is quite refreshing. So often for us, refugee policy in the Middle East is analyzed through the lens of geopolitics alone, and I think a lot of us are responsible for this. But here in this book, civil society is not just decorative, but it's part of it. It's part of the machinery. It may be imperfect, it may be overstretched, and so on and so forth, but it remains essential. I've been doing work over the past few months on Egypt, returning to Egypt to look at how it's treating the Gaza situation and Palestinians trying to flee what is happening there. And one of the things that struck me when I had another look at the book before this is how well El-Taliawi's framework travels. And the dynamics she identifies, this kind of interaction of international pressure and domestic politics and the lived realities of the displaced, this dissonance between formal promises and what actually happens on the ground, right? All this kind of choreography between capacity, coercion, this moral posturing that the regime puts forth, all of these are vividly at play in Egypt today as well, right? And this for me is the hallmark of serious scholarship, that it clarifies something more than just the two cases that it talks about. It helps us think about something else. So I know there's a lot of questions. I'll just end perhaps with what I take to be one of the book's most important provocations. She urges us to resist oversimplifying asylum politics. These are not linear processes, and we have to develop analytical tools that are supple enough to match the fluidity of what's going on the ground somehow. And I'm really happy to see this work emerge as a work of epistemic reflexivity and a degree of humility as well. One of the things that strikes us when you first open up the book is that it insists that knowledge about refugee policy must be co-produced, right? With regional scholars, with local bureaucrats, with those that live and administer all these systems that we are able to study. And we live in an era where refugee policy and refugee regimes are kind of negotiated in London or Geneva, probably, but they are enacted in Mafraq and elsewhere on the ground. So the book offers this necessary vision of rebalancing. And in conclusion, in short, I think it's a rigorous and ambitious book. It reminds us rather quietly, but very, very firmly, that the global south is not marginal to all of this. It's the main stage of this story of global displacement. So I would say congratulations again, Ola. I have no doubt that this book will be read and taught and cited for years to come.
Thank you so much, Gerasimos. And I think that, that point that you concluded on about how, the global south is not sort of a side gig, but it's sort of the primary stage where these issues unfold. And, and the importance of engaging in that process of co-production with those who are, not only knowledge users, but the diverse forms of knowledge. I think that's only accelerated given the dynamics that we're witnessing right now and that we can expect over the next 3 or 4 years, if not beyond. I mean, the notion of there being a singular regime and the way that it's able to predictably respond to these demands, I think, is a question that will unpack. And a lot of your work on sort of the logic of rentier states, right, and extracting resources, like how that logic and Ola, in your framework, talking about how the degree of assistance that can be received, plays such a critical role. So, to anticipate where and how the shifts that we're seeing play out in real time, how the analytical guidance of the book will help sort of us explain what is yet to come. But Jasmin, I'm really keen for your perspectives on this. So much of your work has really focused on these questions of expressions and experiences of power. You're deeply embedded within many of the questions that the book reflects upon. So Jasmin, I'm keen to pass the floor to you for your thoughts and reactions, please. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I think so many wonderful things that I reiterate and agree with have been said already. I think I will add a little bit more in the areas of what I feel have not been said yet. I think first and foremost, the book is bold and gives a much needed, if I may, corrective to this Eurocentric bias that we allow to dominate refugee and forced migration studies, framing the South as a part of the world that always needs to be saved, right? And needs to be rescued by larger powers, by the global North, by all of these problematic terms we continue to use. And I think the central argument for this reason is not only pivotal, but also very refreshing, that, refugee policies in the global South are not ad hoc deviations from this norm in the North. They're not reactionary without being informed, but they're complex, they're evolving, and they happen against the backdrop of internal conflicts and internal understandings, and also very sensitive, often sociocultural dynamics that only exist in this part of the world. I think the book emphasizes very clearly that policies needs to be studied on their own terms, but goes beyond that to even emphasize that they are analytical frameworks in their own right. And I think that that's a very fresh take of the book as well. I think the two major debates that the book contributes to theoretically are, of course, arguing that refugee policymaking in the global South operates under these distinct constraints and logics. But also, I think what it does theoretically is it advances methodological conversations. As someone that works very much on methods, I found the methodological conversations in this book to be some of the most fascinating, introducing complexity theory as this lens to understanding how refugee policies are formulated, how they evolved. And this prompts me, and I'm sure many of your readers, to look at how causality is understood in refugee governance, because often enough I find in the policy space we isolate variables. We isolate variables like economic capacity, regime type, but you demonstrate very clearly in your book how all of these interact systemically and they evolve over time. And this, of course, makes us think outside these linear models, as was mentioned, of course, looking into a little bit more of these dynamic systems modeling in displacement and policy development. What I found most interesting about your book, which is a conversation I have in many spaces, is how comparing two very close countries, seemingly similar to the rest of the world, often very shallowly compared, these two host states. I think the book does a very good job in challenging the assumptions that displacement from a single conflict produces uniform policy responses in host countries because of the fact that there's geographic proximity or because they both happen to be in one part of the world. I definitely, as Gerasimos said, found the quality of the evidence, especially firsthand interviews, to be very commendable. And I think this robust methodology that you have really lays the foundation for the next phase and how a follow-up book, more research can be written, which is maybe with a heavier emphasis on refugee voices, drawing, of course, on the opening of your book where you talk around co-production, because our research continues to teach us that policies, their implications, as well as the means through which they are adjusted and develop over time are absolutely almost exclusively contingent on refugees' responses to them, how they receive them at the community level, how they interact with them. And I think this book prompts the conversation around the distinction between, in the next phase, of course, of more research, refugees largely appearing as policy subjects rather than, policy actors. The book indeed is absolutely important and timely and demonstrates how refugee policy analysis in the two countries that you focus on can also integrate political science methodologies, going back to the methods part that I enjoyed so much about your book, including complexity theory, but also systems thinking. As a trained political scientist myself, I really appreciated that angle of the book very much. You would think that that would be a more commonsensical angle, but in much of the literature that's out there, it's absolutely missing. I think the book succeeds really well at forcing us all to really rethink foundational assumptions about governance and responsibility and solidarity in the global refugee regime, framing it very well, I think, in many sections of the book, moving it away from burden sharing more to responsibility sharing in much of your arguments, which I appreciate very much. And I think the book really forces us to rethink not just these foundational assumptions, but rethink states in the global south as passive recipients of displacement, which is often how these states are framed. Not as active, negotiating, resisting actors that adapt to international refugee norms, that react to them in a way that suits their political needs, but largely as a dumping ground, right? These helpless host states in the global south that are not part of the conversation. And I found your take absolutely very refreshing for this reason. I will stop there. I am very weary of time, and I think Gerasimos also touched upon many things I wanted to say. Thank you so much for the space and the opportunity, Ola. Congratulations.
No, and thank you, Jasmin. And I think, that point that you made about, moving beyond this sort of infantilization of global South states and sort of the notion of embracing complexity, moving beyond, pathologizing global South states as being, either deviant or passive, and sort of really sort of taking seriously this notion that these are political actors, these are sovereign states, and there's a long history of going back to the very origins of refugee and forced migration studies as a field. Barbara Harold Bond's book, Imposing Aid, cautioned us to not engage with the policy priorities of refugee hosting states, either because they lack capacity or their intention is to deny rights. So, this is really, I think, a coming of age moment within the field in saying that we can't ignore the fact that the states do, have policy priorities. They have interests. They pursue those interests. And in Gerasimos, to your point, that these are interests that are beyond moments in time, right? These are interests that endure over periods of time, but these are also interests that are embedded in factors that go well beyond the presence of refugees, right? That these are states that have interests as states have interests. So that I think leads to a really important, set of questions, which is, this enduring debate within the field about, by taking the policy priorities, the policy actions of states, by taking those seriously, as objects of inquiry, right? By focusing on the policy decisions of states, and B, by recognizing that states do have sovereign authority to decide on actions on their territory being influenced by internal and internal and external pressures. Does that create a space where the normative argument for protection becomes eroded? Do we justify restrictive actions by states? Like, how do we square, on the one hand, the analytical imperative to be able to explain what it is that we observe, and then an ethical concern that by explaining, we contribute in some way to a justification of exclusion? And Ola, I know that this is sort of a question that you grappled with within the book, and I'd love your thoughts on that question. And then Gerasimos and Jasmin, from the two of you, because this is something that you also grapple with within your work. I'm keen for your reaction on that question of, is there a moral hazard implicated in engaging with a deep analysis of these policy questions? Well, let's hear from you first with your thought on that.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Jasmin and Gerasimos. I feel really humbled by all of these comments, and they trigger a lot of thoughts, of course. So on this last point, I think it's really important as scholars to try to understand the phenomena that we're dealing with. And this is not to justify government policies if they are falling behind of the humanitarian obligations and expectations, but because in order for us to try to reduce the negative consequences of displacement, we have to really understand what is driving these policies, what is really driving these decisions, who are the actors, what does this subsystem look like, how can we engage with this context in order for us to make things better. And I think the second point is that, as you mentioned, what I tried to do in the book is that I tried to move away from this notion of pathologizing host governments in the global south, and to move away from this narrative that that they are necessarily going to be restrictive of refugee rights, because what we see is that sometimes, in fact, the opposite happens, and there are legal instruments that have been developed in Africa and in Latin America that have even been have gone beyond defining refugee rights, beyond even the Geneva Convention. And so this is something that we can build on, and something that we can highlight, and find the historical roots of it to pave the way forward. We're living in a very pivotal moment for the global refugee regime and for the entire international humanitarian community. And I think that we're witnessing rise in global south actors that want to have a say, and so it might be that we really need to strive more to understand what is actually happening without trying to pathologize them from the outset. And this is not to say that these host governments are always justified. No, of course. And Gerasimos has mentioned the case of Egypt and Gaza, and also Egypt's new asylum law. And I just tweeted today something that an article that was written about this, that Jasmin has also posted on the EU's agreement with Egypt and Lebanon and Tunisia, and how this creates sort of an externalization of migration control beyond Europe's borders, and the shifting of responsibility. And so I think it's very important for us to really try to see beyond the narrative that's been predominant in refugee studies over the past decades, that there is no norm necessarily, and this norm is not just created in the West. there's a lot of variety. There's a lot of variety in refugee groups themselves and their identities. It's a very complex and fluid phenomena, and we really need to engage with it as such. So this is my take on that point.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ola. And on that moral hazard, Jasmin or Gerasimos, would you like to come in on that? Jasmin, why don't we go to you first?
Sure. Thank you so much. I agree with Ola very much. And I think, unfortunately, as we look at migration and displacement in the global south, it has turned into quite the blame game, right? So we never approach this policy conversation around what do Jordan and Lebanon do right? What do they do wrong? And why do they do this wrong? Is it intentional? Is it structural? Is it truly for reasons of incapacity? Or is it a deliberate reaction or a resistance to kind of these international legal frameworks that in many cases countries of the global north promote, but then do not live by? And the global south sees this and recognizes this very much. And in the global south, we continue to witness the hypocrisy within the application of refugee law, how much political will is behind it, and how it actually works when there is political will to make it work. And so instead, as we shift the gaze to the global south, I think this framing is very important. I think, of course, looking at the global south in its own right and at how it reacts, and again, many of the things that it maybe does wrong, but also what is happening outside this part of the world. What is the point of reference? What are we witnessing as governments in the global south, where the majority of displacement takes place, the majority of hosting displaced groups takes place, and the majority of conflicts fueled and intervened in by the global north, who then do not shoulder any of the responsibility attached to these displacement movements? How do we operate in this space? And I think, once again, what the book does well and what I found a refreshing take to be was walking people through the journey. How do we get here? This is not an immediate reaction. This is not something that happens in a vacuum. A policy intervention, particularly in Jordan and in Lebanon, when it comes to Syrian refugees, is much more of a political journey than much of the policy and the blame game highlights. And I think, once again, it's always a challenge for us as we have these conversations to make sure that this entire picture is painted. We, of course, disagree very much with a lot of the response in Lebanon and in Jordan, but we also recognize once again that the comparative game, if it's not a blame game, if we're just striking a comparison, there is much there to unpack, particularly around responsibility sharing and also holding many governments in different parts of the world accountable for their role in causing these displacement movements and where these people end up going. I think I'll hand it over. I've spoken too much. Thank you so much.
No, that's really powerful. Gerasimos, your thoughts on this, please.
Yeah, I would just echo what Ola and Jasmin said, and I think your question really, James, cuts to this deep tension that we have in our field. And I think my work and definitely parts of Ola's book do insist on taking state policy seriously, right? Not as deviation from some kind of norm, but looking at its internal logic. And I think these are not kind of accidental moves. If anything, these are strategic responses by states that are embedded in history, in institutions, in geopolitical realities. And I do agree, James, that these interests do endure beyond specific refugee crises, right? They're tied to survival, regime survival, national identity, all sorts of bargaining. Does the fact that we recognize state policy as important undermine the normative project of protection? No, I'd say it doesn't, but it complicates it in a way, right? Because understanding why Lebanon or Jordan act the way they do doesn't mean justifying every action that they take. I think it means that we refuse to take norm violations as irrational or as failure of some kind of like moral code, right? What we try to ask is what pressures produce this response? What are the asymmetries, the structural issues that can be revealed if we study them, right? So in a way, if anything, I think Ola's book strengthens the normative argument because it shows us where the system fails, not abstractly, but in terms of these negotiations that take place day to day, right? In terms of capacity, coercion, expectations by international actors. So I think to change the system and to fix it, we need to understand these negotiations in a way.
No,
I'll stop
and
there.
I think that no, and I think that that's the very critical point. And what I hear from all of you is to explain isn't to justify, right? To be able to explain why we see the outcomes that we observe is not to say that they are in some way justifiable, but to say, that they are rooted not within some kind of impulsive reaction, but very much a product of an environment, a structural environment within which they take place. And it leads to the question, that structural environment has been changing for many, many years, but is it is facing a very particular moment today and in the foreseeable future, and really through two forms of pressure. One, if we assume that the regime is premised on the need for international cooperation, that responsibility sharing, Jasmin, that you pointed to, but also is predicated on voluntary contributions of states to ease pressures that are faced by countries that host the majority of the world's refugees. And those two pillars of the system, as it was designed 75, 80 years ago, those two assumptions have been eroding for some time, but I think have reached a point arguably of collapse. I mean, in terms of what we see with extraterritorialization, not only from the context of the European Union in pushing out the border and trying to further contain responsibilities within regions, but certainly within the context of the premise of the refugee regime being structured around an international organization which, as a matter of foreign policy, received financial assistance, certainly from the United States, and for that reason, the Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees is always an American. So if we accept that there is sort of a moment of structural change that has been building for some time, but perhaps has reached something of a tipping point, the question then remains with the framework that we have from this book, how can we use these tools in sort of navigating the moment where we find ourselves now? So, the Ola's book takes us up to the COVID pandemic and the challenges that are implicit there. Good social science methodology isn't, predictive in nature. We explain what has happened, but, in the work that you are all doing, where do you see responses to these changing structural realities in which we work? Gerasimos, you mentioned work that you were doing in Egypt right now, although you mentioned what we posted this morning, Jasmin's response to the latest stages in EU asylum policy. I had the great privilege of being in Ethiopia last week at a conference hosted by Addis Ababa University, by Abeba Menaye, the IDRC research chair in Addis. There was a real sense in East Africa when we look at Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, there's a sense that there's a recognition that the structural environment is changing and that host states themselves need to sort of recalculate or recalibrate how they're able to respond with those traditional partners in terms of the external incentives for hosting, the way that they engage with those negotiations, because the resources available are, that reality has changed very much. The ability of the institutions of the refugee regime to engage in asserting its moral and expert authority vis-a-vis other actors within the regime. So, your sense of how the argument of the book can be used for those who are listening to this webinar, who are themselves policymakers or practitioners, what are the tools that can be used not only in explaining this evolution of policy over time, but in how sort of changes in that structural environment are navigated? So, Ola, your sense in terms of what tools you would want to bring to bear for those who are trying to apply this knowledge in the changing realities, What's your sense of how the framework that you present can help in the navigating of changes that we're confronting in real time? Ola, your sense, please.
Yeah, I think the framework provides some categories, some analytical concepts and relationships for us to be able to, again, analyze such deep complexity in a phenomena that takes place that sees rapid developments. Again, political marginality of a very important actor. And so I think it's a very good tool for us to be able to try to look at other cases and other contexts, and to try to maybe not stop there, but also build on it. So the topology that the book develops is just a starting point, and it needs to be tested further in different contexts to see, okay, to what extent does this actually explain variation in host government behavior? And there's so much still to do. We're just starting to scratch the surface of the use of public policy tools and frameworks and methodologies to basically explain public policy and how refugee policies are made. And the hard choices that governments and host governments in the global south are made to face in navigating this very complex policy terrain, and who are the emerging actors. So refugee-led organizations are coming to the fore very much. So Jasmin has mentioned refugee voices as being very, very important, not just in the policy process, but also in scholarship. And that's something that we're all, and I think LERRN is doing a great job in trying to really bring refugee voices and refugee-led organizations into the conversation on the Global Refugee Forum and other spaces, because this is really essential. And I'm really happy that this is happening now. I think we're really expanding the field.
And Jasmin, I want to come to you on that, because it does link back to the point that you made about the active engagement of refugees and refugee-led initiatives within this space. We have this sort of assumption of these massive power asymmetries, assumptions with sort of empirical evidence, these massive power asymmetries within the regime that have so frequently silenced or marginalized the perspectives of those most affected by displacement. But as we saw in the COVID pandemic, as we're seeing right now with sort of the evaporation of that external support, that those who remain on the front lines and are sort of engaged in the everyday politics of negotiating protection are typically, refugee-led, are community partners in different ways. So your sense, Jasmin, on how the tools in the book help us make sense of what is really emerging in real time, and then I'll come to you, Gerasimos. Go ahead, Jasmin, please.
Thank you so much. I think not too much to add on what Ola said, but I think as soon as we talk about refugee voices, participatory approaches to policy making, participatory humanitarian action, even participatory research, I think one of our main approaches should be to move away from tokenizing these actors as well, because it's either that we sideline them entirely, or they're there because we want them to be there for whatever objectives we have. We wrote a paper on this last year where we interviewed Syrian and Palestinian-led organizations across the country around how prioritized they feel in the humanitarian and policy spaces. And while, of course, we drew wonderful lessons around the fact that international organizations, academic spaces, and even policy spaces are aware of their role and they are invited, it's what happens after they're invited that really matters. It doesn't matter so much just that they're there. Again, this tokenizing of having them there. It matters that you take down what they say, that this feeds into the conversation and has the same weight as larger policy actors and humanitarian actors in the space. Respondents saying things to us, okay, I made it to this policy discussion with UNHCR and a bunch of humanitarian actors, and it was a wonderful and privileged space to be in. They let me speak. They took notes. I left. 5 years later, we're still in the same situation. Is that the fault of a single actor, or is it how we approach also this participatory approach? So the only thing to add on Ola's point for me would be that, and I thank you so much for the space again.
Yeah, and it's amazing, again, just following up on that, how that commitment to co-production is not just sort of including in a research agenda that's been baked before it comes to partners, but and again at the conference in Addis last week, it was amazing how refugee researchers were asking questions on these pressing global policy questions, that asking questions that were not on the agenda, but as soon as the questions are asked, the recognition is these are questions that are pressing in the everyday practice of negotiating protection. And yeah, that notion of working in humility, in true partnership, in sharing power. It's not just an ethically desirable thing to do, but substantively it leads to better research that is going to be much more useful and usable in the context where it is. So I think that's a critical point. Gerasimos, to you, please, before I move on to a last question, mindful of the time. Gerasimos, to you, please.
Yes, very, very briefly then. I think I can link your question back to Ola's book, essentially. And what Ola is doing quite well is that she explains policy outcomes in both cases as essentially pattern behavior. These states are not really responding to crisis. They are positioning themselves in this, right? And they're doing so strategically. And in a way, James, you're absolutely right that the global refugee regime is facing a crisis in terms of we no longer see refugees as a shared responsibility. States stop voluntarily kind of contributing to the system, right? All of the things. But what Ola does well is that it allows us to see this inflection point in the sense that these global South states are neither victims nor kind of villains, right? They just position themselves here and they improvise within a regime that doesn't really function anymore. But to be provocative, and I'm curious to hear what you think, in a way, is this a moment of collapse of the global refugee regime, or is it more of a revelation that perhaps this system never really distributed responsibility equally, right? Like what's collapsing is less the regime itself, but our pretense that things were working before now somehow in a way. So I would say, as we move into this new phase that you said about post-COVID, authoritarianism, blah, 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 the value of the book is that it kind of decenters crisis and it takes us away from crisis and more into this system of governance, right? So the tools that she's offering are there for us. We just need to update them, update the inputs perhaps. We have new actors, we have new technologies, we have all sorts of novel kind of processes come in. But I think the core insight is still there, that these global South policies are strategic, they're complex, but they're not reactive in a way. So that's my quick answer to that.
And I think it is this question about, often we say, was the regime ever really there? Or, was it only just sort of a tool that is used? And I think this is something we can discuss. I'm very mindful of the time. I'm also mindful of the fact that I was assuming that we were scheduled for an hour and a half, but we were in fact scheduled for an hour. And I know Jasmin has to go for another commitment. Gerasimos, thank you for that point. Jasmin, I'm keen to give you sort of a final word on this question about on moving forward from here. Ola, I'll then give you a final word before we conclude. Jasmin, to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think I've had enough space to communicate everything I wanted to already. I think one of the major takeaways from this is what a solid foundation this book is for further research, again, and for not only understanding the comparative angle that you give us, but also understanding how we use your robust methodology as a base for being more inclusive, again, and more participatory. The only component missing from this conversation are the voices of the people that you dedicate the book to, and I think that's a very big takeaway from this. I thank you all for the space, and I'm sorry that I do have to run, but congratulations again, Ola. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasmin. Ola, a last word to you on what, what do you want to take us, what do you want us to take away from the book and from the conversation, please?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jasmin, and for the time that you've dedicated to this, and for this last note on the importance of perhaps having had a refugee-led organization be represented on the panel as well. Moving forward, I think that we are in a moment of reckoning. And I think Gerasimos' remarks on whether it's a revelation or a collapse of the pretense, or regardless of what it is, I think that it's a moment of crisis, and crisis provides at the same time opportunity. But it's very important for us to rise to the challenge, to rise to the occasion as scholars, as activists, as humanitarians, as simply people who are concerned about what is happening globally, and for us to engage with this humbly, because again, we really need to correct a lot of historical injustices, a lot of historical problematics with narratives, with how scholarship was produced, and so on and so forth. We're seeing rise again, like as Gerasimos thankfully has pointed out, in new inputs like technology that's going to be to have a lot of it's going to have a lot of impact. We need to be alert, and I hope that this book just is, a very small contribution to all of this.
Thank you so much, Ola. And I think that note, of humility, but also in a conviction that rigorous analysis that is really in partnership with those most affected, that is, situated and takes seriously the context and the spaces within which we do this work, where it's not seeking to, back to Chimney's argument from 27 years ago. Let's recognize that if all knowledge production is concentrated in the global north, that we reproduce the assumptions and the policy paradigms of the global north. And so I think it really is a call not only for an ethical commitment, but a substantive commitment to recognizing the value, the significance of co-producing knowledge and of supporting knowledge production by those who are very much, living this reality day to day. With that, my sincere thanks to all of you, and my humble apologies as a moderator, having arranged myself for a 90-minute webinar. I'm so very grateful that everyone gave of their time. Ola, thank you for writing this book, and thank you for sharing that with us. Gerasimos and Jasmin, thank you for your generosity of an extra 30 minutes. I'll give you back 30 minutes of your life at some point along the way. But for your engagement and contribution to this, my sincere thanks. Thank you to Isaac, Nadia, and the entire LERRN team, not only in supporting the webinar, the promotional material ahead of time, but also who will now be editing this webinar and posting it online. So stay tuned for the recording of this webinar. And finally, my thanks to all of you who, by my calculation, have joined us from 4 continents and 7 different time zones to participate in this webinar. We weren't able to get all of your questions, but the questions that you posed really speak to the importance of these topics and the significance of rigorous analysis and providing tools that help us navigate the challenges that we're facing today. So my sincere thanks to everybody. Please take a moment to complete the survey on the webinar experience on ways that we can make it better. Stay tuned for a new chapter in the life of LERRN. An announcement will be coming in about a month's time on a next phase of the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network. But for now, my sincere thanks to all of you. Wherever you're joining us from, stay well and stay safe. Thank you for joining this conversation. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.